Okay, earlier we looked at investigation, inquiry, examination, questions. When we say we are doing a philosophical study of any subject, we can say that asking questions, examining, analyzing, investigating, and also looking for consistency, coherence, and logicality. Now, when we look at the first few items, asking questions, examining, analyzing, and investigating. Now, the very concept of question is important, the theme in Buddhist philosophy. Whenever we talk about, say, Buddhist philosophy, we are also talking about raising questions. So, Panya or Prashna, or raising questions itself is very much a part of Buddhist philosophy and Buddhist philosophical method. So in a way we can say that we don't need to come to this from any other tradition, or we don't need to come to this from Western tradition. Now if you look at the Buddhist tradition itself, you know that Buddha asked questions, and then Buddha answered those questions. And Buddha also encouraged other people to ask questions, right? So now this is something very interesting in the Buddhist tradition. Now in the Buddhist tradition we see that sometimes Buddha asks questions in order to explain something. First Buddha asked the question with the intention of explaining, and then having listened to what the listeners have to say, then the Buddha would explain it. Now very often when the Buddha comes to the Dhamma Sabha, where the monks gathered, the Buddha asks, okay, what is the discussion I interrupted by coming? And then, they will say, okay, this is what we have been talking. And then Buddha would give an explanation. So, Buddha asks questions for different purposes, right? In the Buddhist tradition, there are different purposes why Buddha asks, depending on the situation. If a situation arose, Buddha would ask Attupattika, and then similarly Buddha would ask questions in order to explain. Buddha would ask questions in order to remove the doubts. So, for different purposes, Buddha used to ask questions. And then also in the discourses we find category of, the different category of questions. Like questions are categorized. So the different questions asked by the people. So there is an analysis of questioning. You can see the questioning itself is a very sophisticated, developed aspect of, say, any philosophy, right? I mean, basically it shows the openness of the philosophy, allowing listeners to ask questions is, being open about it, right? Now, you remember when the Digha Nikaya was translated into English, Rhys Davids named it the Dialogues of the Buddha. Now, dialogue, this very word, dialogue, dia means two, log means talk. So the dialogue means talking to people, dialogue. The opposite word is called monologue. Monologue means one person speaking and others listening. But dialogue is basically between two people or two groups. Now that very concept shows that Buddha was willing to share ideas with others, right? In a dialogue, dialogical situation, both people talk, both people ask. Two people are, in a way we can say, similar. But of course, when the Buddha was dialoguing with a disciple, it doesn't mean that Buddha and disciple are the same or similar. But on the other hand, as two people who are dialoguing, they can be similar as a partners of dialogue. So the idea of dialogue is shows that openness for questioning, and then we have different types of questions. Vibhajya Vyakaraniya, we have questions Tapaniya, like that. We have direct questions that you can ask from directly, Patipuccha Visajjaniya, by asking, answering the question by asking a counter question, like that. So there are different, Vibhajya Vyakaraniya means you have to analyze the question before you answer the question. You have to analyze the question. That is what means Vibhajya. Because if you just give direct answer, then that answer can be misleading or wrong even. So you first analyze the question and, sometimes, we have to analyze the question. And sometimes there are certain questions, Patipuccha Visajjaniya, like you ask a counter question. So answer is really asking another counter question, right? So asking a counter question can be a way of answering, or analyzing can be a way of answering, or directly you can answer certain questions. And the most important among these four categories is Tapaniya questions, the questions that has to be set aside by not answering. So it does mean that you don't have to answer all the questions. Particularly if you have the wrong question, then of course you can't answer the wrong question. But then you have to make the question right. In a discussion, sometimes Buddha would say, no kalho panho, no kallo panho, which means that the question is not proper. So you can see there, the kind of, some kind of critique of question, no kalho panho, kallo. The question is not proper. So Buddha says that, the question you ask is not proper. Now you see there you have, before answering the question, you are analyzing the question. So Buddha is not answering any question and every question. So when the Buddha says is no kalho panyo, the question is not good. So particularly, you remember in one instance, Buddha was asked the question, Ko Vijnana Aharang Aharati. Who partakes the Vijnana Ahara? Who partakes the Vijnana Ahara? Ko Vijnana Aharang Aharati. Buddha said, no kallo panyo. Buddha said the question is wrong. Question is not proper. Because why Buddha says so? Because when you ask Ko Vijnana Aharang Aharati, the question assumes that there is a person, there is an agent who partakes Vijnana Ahara. Buddha said, no, there is no such person. So because there is no such person, the question Ko Vijnana Aharang Aharati is wrong. Then Buddha said, if you ask, on what conditions Vijnana Ahara takes place, I can answer. You see, then Buddha corrected the question. Buddha corrected the question. So if you ask Ko Vijnana Aharang Aharati is wrong, but if you ask on what conditions Vijnana Ahara occurs, then Buddha said, according to Paticcasamuppada, Buddha explained that according to these conditions, when these conditions is there, Vijnana Ahara occurs. Now you see, in other words, what I am saying is this. The very idea of question is a very important theme in the Buddha's teaching. Okay? just the question, just the idea of question, different types of questions, different categories of question. Actually, that very aspect is something very important for somebody to do a deep research, really. But then the important thing in this discussion is, the very attitude to questions. Questions are encouraged, and then there is a critique of the questions itself. Now, that shows a very high philosophical attitude. So the analysis of question, the very fact that within Buddhist tradition there is a very strong tradition of not only asking questions but even critiquing the questions, questioning questions. Okay, you not only encourage people to ask questions, Buddha has a critique of the question, questions about the questions. Now, that's a philosophically very interesting thing. When we particularly talk about philosophy, people say that philosophy started because people started questioning. Without accepting the perceived reality, without accepting the world as it is, people ask questions. Now, that is considered to be the beginning of philosophy. If you don't have any questions, then no problem, but it doesn't go anything beyond that, because you don't have any questions. Now, the very fact that the philosophy is that people ask about questions. In Western philosophy, we say that the first philosopher in the Western tradition is called Thales. Now, Thales is known in the philosophy world for saying that everything is water. Now, when you look at as an idea, for someone to say that everything is water, that person needs to be a little bit different mind, right? Otherwise, how can you say this is water, and all these things is water? So it looks like a crazy idea. How can you say that everything is water? But on the other hand, why? I mean, of course, there is an element of truth, because everything is made of Patavi, Apo, Tejo, Vayu, right? So in that sense, everything has Apo. But more than that, what is important is person like Thales is considered to be a philosopher because he did not accept, what he sees. He wanted to go beyond what he sees. Now, when we see this, we don't see Patavi, Apo, Tejo, Vayu, right? In order to see Patavi, Apo, Tejo, Vayu, you have to analyze, you have to go behind, you have to go deeper. Now, that is philosophy, okay? Now, you can't go deeper like that if you don't ask questions. So when Thales said that everything is water, it's not a joke, okay? When he said that, it's not a joke, because it indicates that you are asking question. You have the questioning mind. You have a questioning mentality. So the questioning mentality and critiquing the questions, to have some kind of philosophy of questions, is something unique in the Buddha's tradition, okay, in Buddhism. So what I am saying to you is, in a philosophical study, questioning is very important. Not only that, some of you can do a research paper, or write on really the questions and the questioning, attitude to questions, types of questions. There is so much material if you think about the questions of the Buddha. And what are the correct questions? What are the wrong questions? If you ask a wrong question, how can you get the right answer? So Buddha corrected the question, okay? And then also these, the different purposes Buddha asked questions. And then the different types of answer, Patipucca Vyakaraniya, Vibhajya Vyakaraniya, Ekansa Vyakaraniya. Certain questions can be given direct answers. And then finally Tapaniya, you set aside certain questions by not answering. Now, there are so many books and articles written on why Buddha did not answer some questions. There are so many books, In my own, one of my publications, I have a chapter on these so-called unanswered questions. Now there are books, there are articles. So I'm saying you, pointing out to you two things. One thing is questions itself is a very interesting and important topic in the Buddhist philosophy. Okay? Questions, nature of questions, types of questions. Why Buddha did not answer certain questions, and so on and so forth. The next thing, the second thing I am saying is that questioning is an important way to study the Buddhist philosophy. I mean Buddhism, Buddhist teaching. So in a philosophical way of studying Buddhism, what we are saying is questioning is a very important thing you can do. So the questioning, investigation, examining, analyzing, investigation. And these are some very important things when we look from the philosophical perspective or philosophical method of doing research, okay? And then we have some other concepts, consistency, coherence, and logicality. What are these things? What is consistency, coherence, and logicality? I'm sorry. We have what are these three concepts? Consistency and coherence are kind of connected with each other. And then we have logicality. Consistency means we are talking about ideas matching with each other. Ideas or statements tallying with each other. Ideas or statements not contradicting each other. Now that is consistency. Okay? Now in philosophical writings, in the philosophical investigation, to examine the ideas whether they are consistent. Okay? If two ideas are not consistent, then one has to be true and other has to be false. Okay? Otherwise, they are consistent. If they are not consistent with each other, then they are, one can be true, the other has to be false. So the consistency. So the idea of when we study Buddhism, say karma theory or Four Noble Truths, so any particular Buddhist concept, we can see whether there are any ideas not consistent with each other. Okay? Now, when we look at the Buddha's sermons, we can see that Buddha was very much aware of and then concerned about this. And in one place Buddha says, I think this comes in Satchaka's discussion with Buddha. Buddha says, Nakote sandhiyati purimenava pachimang, pachimenava purimang. Buddha says that what you earlier said doesn't go along with what you later said. What you later said doesn't go along with what you earlier said. What the Buddha says is, what you said earlier and what you said later are not consistent with each other. Now what is that? So that's Buddha's concern about consistency of ideas. So when the two people are talking to each other, the ideas have to be consistent. So the looking for consistency is a very important thing. Now when we look at the Buddhist tradition, Buddhist history, we can see that sometimes there have been questions even among the Buddhists about the consistency. Now for example, in the Buddhist tradition, a later development was Pudgalavada. Pudgalavada means some Buddhists believe that although there is no Atma, there is a Pudgala. Now in order for people to believe that there is a Pudgala, what happened was that they thought that unless they believe in the Pudgala, they can't explain karma, punarbhava, nirvana, sansara, and these things, they thought that they cannot explain. Now at the heart of the whole issue is the consistency. They thought that, if you accept Anatmavada as it is, you cannot explain how a person is born again. So, while accepting Anatmavada, they were trying to be consistent by bringing in Pudgalavada. So this is one way of looking at the Pudgalavada. Now you see the whole issue is whether the ideas are consistent. So within the Buddhist tradition itself, people had debates about whether the certain ideas are consistent or not. Okay. Now when I say this, you may be thinking, why do you have to look for? Because everything Buddha said is consistent. Why do you have to look for coherence? Everything Buddha said is coherent. But no, actually what the Buddha said may be coherent. But what is reported in the discourses may be not coherent. Because discourses have been memorized for a long time and then recorded. There can be certain things that are not consistent with each other. Now in philosophical study, that is one thing we are doing, whether the ideas are consistent with each. And then coherence is something related, but of course different. Coherence means, in fact, when we take the whole set of ideas, whether this set of ideas are agreeable with all the other ideas. You take one particular idea, whether that particular idea is, the cohere with rest of the ideas. So it is not really the consistency. Consistency means you are talking about the two sets of ideas. Coherence can be within a system. So say for example in the Buddha's teaching, there can be certain ideas. So you bring in one idea and see whether that idea coheres with other ideas, tallies with other ideas. Of course it doesn't say whether it is true or not. Simply it means that it goes along with rest of the ideas. I will give you an example. Now one example from the Buddhist tradition itself is the idea of Mahapadesa. Mahapadesa. Now Mahapadesa, the great criteria, great indicators. So Mahapadesa. Maha means great. Apadesa means we can say criterion. Buddha comes with great criterion. The idea of great criterion, this comes in the Mahaparinibbana Sutta. Now, when the Buddha was approaching Parinirvana, among the disciples, there were some questions. One question was, when the Buddha attained Parinirvana, to whom should they go and ask questions? How do they know? How they can determine if somebody comes and say this is what the Buddha said? How do you know it? Now if the Buddha is living, then people can go to the Buddha and ask whether Buddha said this or not. But when the Buddha attained Parinirvana, how can you know? Now this is a serious question because during the time of the Buddha, what the Buddha said was memorized by people. Venerable Ananda memorized the Dhamma, Venerable Upali memorized the Vinaya, and then there were many others who memorized what the Buddha said. So when the Buddha attained Parinirvana, somebody can come and say that, well, I heard this from the Buddha and I was the only person there. There was nobody else. Then of course, what are you going to do? Then Buddha says, if someone comes and says something like that, don't reject it, don't accept it. Okay? Neither rejecting nor accepting. What you need to do is sutte otare tabbani vinaya sandasse tabbani. You compare it with vinaya, sutta. You put it into sutta. If it fits in the sutta, then fine. Vinaya sandasse tabbani. You compare it with vinaya. Now, you sutte otare tabbani means it is like a jigsaw puzzle. You put all the pieces into due places, and then there comes a picture. So if you can put all the the pieces into one coherent total, then of course there is a picture. So this particular thing said by the other person has to be coherent with everything else said in the discourses. Also coherent with things said in the Vinaya. Now you see the concept of coherence is different from the consistency. Coherence means you take a whole set of, you can say, assertions or things said by the Buddha, whether this particular statement or assertion goes along with other things, tallies with other things. Okay? Now that is coherence. So Buddha gives this criterion. So in a philosophical study, one thing we do is we can look for whether a certain idea mentioned in the discourses or referred to in the text or said by somebody, whether this particular idea is coherent with other ideas. Now this is the great, the Maha Upadesa given by the Buddha. In a philosophical study, what we can do is we can look for coherence of idea. So consistency, coherence is, whether the ideas are telling with each other. When you take the complete picture, whether this particular thing goes along with what the Buddha said. Okay. And then logicality means, there are certain logical principles, certain logical thinking accepted something to be rational or methodical. So now this is a very broad thing. When you say logicality, of course, logic can be Eastern logic, Western logic, Indian logic, and the Buddhist logic, and so on. We are talking about many different types of logic. But in these things, what I mean by logicality is there are certain, almost universally accepted certain things, whether those are followed in. Now, for example, whether it is Buddhism or whether it is West or East, there are certain things universally accepted. Now, if I make a statement P, and then I make another statement not P, then of course you can't put P and not P together. If P is true, not P is false. If not P is true, P is false, right? So now that is accepted by everybody, right? For example, whole thing is like when you tell a lie. Actually, lie is really a contradiction. You did something and you say you did not do it. You contradicting your behavior with what you said, right? So I did it, I did not do it. So there are two statements. One is necessarily false, right? If you did that, then I did it is true. I did not do it is false, right? You remember when the Buddha was describing the Musavada in the Dhamma, there's a very important term used, that is abhisangvada ko lokassa. Abhisangvada ko lokassa. Now a person who tells the truth, he is abhisangvadaka. Visangvadaka means he contradicts. Abhisangvadaka means a person who doesn't contradict. For example, when you are asked whether you did this, if you did it, you say yes. If you did not do it, you say no. There, of course, you are not contradicting. But if you did it and if you say no, I did not, then you are visangvadaka. You are contradicting your statement and the behavior. So the person who is telling truth has been described as abhisangvadako lokassa, abhisangvadaka. So visangvada means basically contradiction. Abhisangvadaka means non-contradiction. So now these are basically what we can say logicality. Now that is accepted everywhere, right? We can say even universally. Truth or falsehood depends on this idea. So therefore we can talk about logicality. Now when we say we are doing a philosophical study, remember it could be asking questions, examining, analyzing, investigation. And also it could be looking for consistency, coherence and logicality of something. You apply these things to the text, to the suttas, to the books, to the things said, and then you analyze these things, okay? Now, I know in your studies you basically do a lot of studying and memorizing and try to understand, try to different ways of explaining. But it is also important for you to apply these categories, what I said in the number 1, okay? So apply those things and see whether, because there can be contradictions, there can be coherences. incoherences. Because we are dealing with the literature, written books, things said by people. So therefore, looking from that point of view is actually looking at the teaching and the literature from philosophical point of view. Now moving on, the studying Buddhism from the perspective of different branches of philosophy, such as ethics, epistemology, logic, ontology, metaphysics, etc. Now number one is asking questions, etc. is one thing. The second is philosophical study means the study Buddhism from the perspective of different branches of Western philosophy, such as ethics. Now, for example, you can make a study on Buddhist ethics. You can make a study on Buddhist epistemology. You can make a study on Buddhist logic. You can make a study of Buddhist ontology. And also you can make a study of Buddhist metaphysics. Now, when you do Buddhist studies in line of these themes, then of course you are doing a philosophical study. Now, for example, you take ethics. Now, when we say ethics, ethics is basically dealing with good and bad and right and wrong. However, in the Western philosophical tradition, they have developed whole gamut of concepts related to it, different criteria, different critiques. So we have to know these things, and we can look at the Buddhist ethics from the point of view of ethics in the Western philosophy, or philosophy basically. Now that is a philosophical study. In other words, you take the concept of ethics from the Western tradition, and then we look at the Buddhist tradition, the Buddhist ethics. Now, of course, there are so many books written in English language on Buddhist ethics. For example, Peter Harvey, Damien Keown, early book is Venerable Saddhatis, and then a Japanese scholar called Tachibana. So there are large number of texts written from the point of view of ethics in Buddhism. So many books. Now, Buddhist ethics. And looking from perspective of ethics, Buddhist philosophy, Buddhist teachings is an ethical study. Now, ethics is basically the branch of philosophy that deals with good and bad and right and wrong. Generally, we call value judgments. So, ethics is basically value judgments. So, that branch of knowledge, a study which deals with value judgments, is called ethics. Now, epistemology means a study of theory of knowledge. Epistemology, a study of knowledge. Philosophical study of knowledge is called epistemology. Now, there is a way to study Buddhist philosophy from the perspective of epistemology, from the theory of knowledge. Now, again, when we say epistemology or theory of knowledge, in philosophy, there are certain questions that are asked, and there are certain perspectives that you look at knowledge. What is knowledge? What do we mean by knowledge? And what are the sources of knowledge? That means, how do we get knowledge? From the Indian and Buddhist tradition, often they mention two different things, pratyaksha and anumana. Perception and inference as the means of knowledge. That is in the Indian and Buddhist tradition. When you look at Western tradition, we know empiricism, knowledge based on the perception, and rationalism, knowledge based on the reasoning. In my earlier discussions, I showed to you in the both Western and Eastern traditions, at some point we believe that knowledge comes from the books, or knowledge comes from divine revelation. So those are also means of knowledge, but of course no longer accepted by many people today. But basically empiricism and rationalism from Western point of view, or pratyaksha and anumana from Eastern and Buddhist point of view. So studying Buddhism from epistemology means actually looking at Buddhist philosophy from those point of views. Now, you see the philosophical study can be philosophical study of Buddhist theory of knowledge. Philosophical study can be a study of Buddhist theory of good and bad and right and wrong. Now, if you look at from that point of view, there is so much in the Buddhist tradition about good and bad, kusala, kusala, punya, papa, how these concepts are being used. Are they all the same or are they different? How are they going to be different? And so on and so forth. You can raise many questions on those things. So ethics. And then logic, ontology. Now logic is again, logic can be the Western logic can be Buddhist logic can be Indian logic in general. When we talk about Indian logic in general, we are talking about Nyaya philosophy, which is the basic Brahmanic Hindu philosophy. And then we also talk about the Buddhist logic. And in addition to that, in logic, we are talking about today what has been developed in the Western tradition, starting from Aristotle, and what has been developed. Now, logical study can be actually according to logical principles. Now, basically consistency, coherence, and logicality. When we study Buddhism from this point of view, in fact, we can say this is really, we can say, logical study of Buddhism. So, so when we say logical study, we are using logic as a kind of method. So if we are looking at the Buddhist studies from the point of view of consistency, coherence, and logicality, then we are talking about logical study of Buddhism. Okay. Now, same thing with ontology. Ontology means existence. What are the things that do exist? What are things that don't exist? So the ontology. For example, in ontology they talk about the existence of things. Now, from the Buddhist perspective, we can think about what is the ontological status of Atta, Atma. Does Atma really exist or not? Now, if we are discussing that problem, that's an ontological problem or ontological approach, Does Atma exist or not? Do I exist or not? What is the ontological status? What are the things that supposed to be existing or not? And sometimes there are people, the discussions about apaya and sugati and duggati, whether these things really exist. Are they really places? Now that can be ontological study. And also finally, there can be discussions on Nibbana, whether Nibbana really exists or not. If you look at Buddhaghosa's Visuddhimagga, there is a discussion to the effect that Buddhaghosa is discussing in the Visuddhimagga to say that Nibbana is a bhava. Bhava. Bhava means bhu, to exist. And Buddhaghosa says that Nibbana is not abhava, but Nibbana is sabhava. Now, there is a long discussion to prove that Nirvana is not abhava, Nibbana is bhava. Now, that type of study is really, in a way we can say that is a discussion on the ontological status of Buddhism. Nirvana. So, whether Nirvana really exists or not. So, you can see, and then metaphysics. I referred to metaphysics earlier, but in philosophy what is meant by metaphysics is basically what is not a part of our sensory experience is metaphysics. What is not a part of our ordinary regular sensory experience. Now in that sense we can say that many things in Buddhism like heaven, hell and lot of things can be metaphysics. But whether we are using those things, whether we understand those things as metaphysics is the important thing. Now in Buddhism we talk about Dibba Chakku, we talk about Dibba Sota, divine ear, divine eye. What we see from divine eye, divine ear, according to Western philosophy can be metaphysics. But are they metaphysics according to Buddhism? We have to raise these questions because if you develop Dibba Chakku, then you see things that you don't see in ordinary eyes. Okay? So, but then is that considered to be metaphysics? As such things were considered metaphysics in the Western tradition? You know, we can raise these questions. So this is another way of doing Buddhist philosophy. Now the third way I'm trying to explain today is studying different philosophical aspects, areas of Buddhism, such as Buddhist ethics, Buddhist theory of knowledge, Buddhist philosophy of mind, Buddhist philosophy of individual and society, Buddhist philosophy of economics, Buddhist philosophy of consumption, etc. Now this is another way of doing philosophical study. Okay, the number 2 and number 3 are related, but the difference is number 2 we are looking from Buddhism from those perspectives. Number 3 is little bit different because there we are talking about the Buddhist ethics, not Buddhism from ethical perspective, but simply what we consider to be Buddhist ethics or Buddhist epistemology, right? Actually, the two are connected because whenever we say Buddhist ethics, because we are borrowing this word from Western philosophy, we are bringing in certain categories from that. But it doesn't have to be necessarily so, because even though we call something Buddhist ethics, we can say that Buddhist ethics is fundamentally different from the Western types of ethical considerations. Same thing for Buddhist epistemology, right? So, I mean, although we borrow the term from Western philosophy, under number 3, it doesn't have to be exactly according to the Western philosophy or anything. But we can talk about Buddhist epistemology, the concept of knowledge in Buddhism, without reference to, at all to or much to Western philosophy. But still we can talk about the concept of Buddhist knowledge. Okay? Buddhist concept of mind. Now actually in the whole Abhidhamma is a very interesting aspect of, we are studying Buddhist concept of mind. Of course, Abhidhamma is not only that. Abhidhamma studies Nibbana, Abhidhamma studies Rupa, but Abhidhamma studies Chitta and Cetasika. So far as Chitta and Cetasika are concerned, we can say Abhidhamma is a Buddhist philosophy of mind, Buddhist philosophy of individual and society. And also we can talk about Buddhist philosophy of economics, Buddhist philosophy of consumption. Those things we are using the term philosophy somewhat watered down sense. When we say Buddhist philosophy of consumption, consume things. So we can talk about modern consumerism, and then what are the Buddhist ideas on consumption, how to consume things according to Buddhism. Even the Paccavekkhana, Pratyaveksha, you are doing is something to do with consumption, right? What should be the attitude when we consume things? What should be our attitude about the things the robes you wear and the meals you take? All these are Buddhist philosophy of consumption. So what I'm trying to tell you is this: under number 3, you can do many studies of Buddhism from different perspectives of philosophy. So 3 ways of studying Buddhism philosophically. Basically, these are the ways that you can study. Finally, I have given you K.N. Jaytilaka's early Buddhist theory of knowledge is a good example for this category of studies. Of course, there are many studies of this nature, but I have given this just one but very important study done on Buddhism. K.N. Jaytilaka, he published this book early, Buddhist theory of knowledge. Now, theory of knowledge really means epistemology. Now, this is a very good example. I think it is very good for all of you to get a hold of this book and read and see how he has developed this theme. Now, early Buddhist theory of knowledge is basically theory of knowledge or the discussion of knowledge in Buddhism as found in the early discourses, which means, he doesn't go to commentaries or anything, but he basically deals with the discourses. and then he develops this very interesting research based on that. And finally, K.N. Jaitileka concludes that Buddhism is a type of empiricism. Okay? Up to that point, certain scholars believe that Buddhism is a type of rationalism. But as against those views, K.N. Jaitileka proposes this idea that Buddhism is a form of empiricism. Now, he gives a very interesting interpretation to empiricism and shows the limits of empiricism in the modern philosophy. And, they explains the Buddhist concept of empiricism. So you can see that he combines modern, Western philosophical ideas and brings in them to Buddhist studies. And then, in other words, early Buddhist theory of knowledge is a text that views, try to understand the Buddhist epistemology from the perspective of, from some ideas of Western philosophy. But that doesn't mean to say that, he says that, everything goes according to Western philosophy. No, it is nothing like that. But simply, he understands from the point of view of Western philosophy. Now, the very concept of theory of knowledge is a philosophical concept. Because if you take the Buddha's teaching, Buddha didn't categorize his teaching into ethics, epistemology, metaphysics, and so on, right? Because Buddha taught all these things together. Now, in any discourse of the Buddha, you have ethics, epistemology both together. And also you have metaphysics, the idea about reality, and then what is good and bad, ultimately how should you attain it. If you take Four Noble Truths, you have theory of knowledge and ethics and everything there. So Buddha, we can say that Buddha, it is wrong to say that Buddha talked about epistemology or ethics or anything like that in the modern sense. But on the other hand, as a part of our study, we can isolate only that aspect and make a study. But at the same time, we should remember that Buddha never spoke on epistemology alone. Okay? Buddha never spoke on ethics alone. For Buddha, everything is, he taught all these things together. But of course, today we can isolate certain things and study. So long as we have in our mind about what we are doing, it should not be a problem. But if we think that Buddha only talked about epistemology, that is wrong. And also, when we talk about epistemology, we need to know in what context Buddha talked about that. What Buddhism means by knowledge. So at the beginning of discussion, we looked at the concept of philosophy, Sophia as wisdom. Now, in Buddhist tradition, when I discuss with you the concept of knowledge, knowledge can be Sutame Panya, knowledge can be Chintame Panya, knowledge can be Bhavaname Panya. So Sutame Panya is, what we get from learning, hearing, reading. But then Chintame Panya is by analyzing what we know in our mind, logically, we get the knowledge. And then ultimately we get Bhavaname knowledge, Bhavaname Panya. That Bhavana means you improve, you develop, you culture. Through that you get certain types of knowledge. Now that is not a kind of knowledge you get from books, so very different. So you can see that within the Buddhist tradition itself, we get many different concepts of knowledge. Okay? So Buddhist analysis of knowledge or Buddhist theory of knowledge can be something we can do as a separate part of a study. Again, I should say that we should know that, of course, Buddha never teach any of these things in isolation, right? But today, for the sake of purpose of studying, we can isolate those aspects, but at the same time, we must have an idea how to connect these things to the totality of the philosophy of the Buddha, okay? Now, finally, to sum up what I said so far, today we were discussing how to do a philosophical study of Buddhism. And then philosophical study of Buddhism as one mode of or one manner of doing Buddhist research. Now, suppose some of you want to select your research topic or your MPhil or PhD or any degree, then this can be another way of doing research. How are we going to study Buddhism? Okay, we are going to study Buddhism from the philosophical point of view. Now, when we say we are going to study Buddhism from philosophical point of view, we need to have some idea about what are the philosophical categories. Now, here basically I based my presentation on Western philosophy. Nevertheless, we should not think that Western philosophy is the only philosophy, okay? I mean, Western world, Western tradition developed what is called philosophy. But on the other hand, when we look at the Indian Brahmanic Hindu tradition, of course they have their own darshana. And in the Buddhist tradition, we have, of course, in the Buddha's teaching, Buddha never developed, anything like epistemology or ethics so separately. But when you look at these things, you can see in the Buddha's teaching ethics, epistemology, metaphysics, and everything. So there is a possibility that we can study those things from that point of view. But then basically in Buddhism, there is a concept of truth, there is a concept of knowledge, there is a concept of liberation, there is a concept of good and bad. Now, those are very fertile fields to do research. So whenever we do a research of that sort, we can say we are doing a philosophical study of Buddhism. And even if do not go to ethics, epistemology and things like that, if you simply look at the certain philosophical methods like investigation, inquiry, examination, questioning, consistency, coherence, and logicality. Now, any subject you can be studying, but from those point of view, then it becomes a philosophical study. So two things. One thing is, studying Buddhism from the philosophical categories like ethics, epistemology, metaphysics, ontology, and so on. The other thing is studying Buddhism or any subject of Buddhism from those criteria, from those methods, asking questions, examining, analyzing, investigating, looking for consistency, coherency, and logicality. Okay, thank you. And if you have any questions or comments, anything that was not clear, so you can ask. Are you ready to do philosophical study of Buddhism, or how do you feel about it? Yes, sir.
As much as I understand it, if someone to make philosophical study, we can use those matter. My question is, if someone want to make a philosophical study, in which field is it the most suitable to make a philosophical study?
Well, in fact, we cannot say which field is the most suitable. Now, if you look at basically ethics, epistemology, logic, in these three areas, a lot of research have been already done, because a lot of people, do research on Buddhist ethics. For example, as I said, I mentioned few names in today's philosophical world. Now in Sri Lanka, one Professor P.D. Premasiri, and then another one Gunapala Dharmasiri. Those people have written about Buddhist ethics. And then in the world at large, people like, as I said, Damien Keown, and then Peter Harvey, those are two known names, and also Professor Kalupana. Even Professor K.N. Jatilaka has written on Buddhist ethics. The Buddhist ethics, and then as I said earlier, Professor Saddhatissa, Hambalava Saddhatissa, a Sri Lankan Buddhist monk who lived in England, and also one Tachibana, a Japanese scholar So there's a whole gamut of people who have studies Buddhism from ethical point of view or Buddhist ethics. However, that doesn't mean that you can't do. When you study all those things, you can always pick up certain area which have not been done by those people, or which have not well done by those people, or which has been neglected, or you can find. But of course, in order to know, you have to know really who has done what. So you have to read those things. Now the same thing with epistemology. Now, early Buddhist theory of knowledge is 1963. So you can see it is 37, 47, almost 50 years, half a century ago. So there are, the people have improved. People have different opinions based on K. N. Jayatilaka. So I myself have written on certain aspects of early Buddhist theory of knowledge on K. N. Jayatilaka's ideas. So you can see again, epistemology is an area. So the many people have written from philosophical point of view. So it depends on what you like. Now, basically, if you go to ethics, then studying ethics from Western point of view is important thing. Now, if you go to epistemology, again, knowing about the knowledge, theories of knowledge. So, you can't do everything, but you have to select one or two areas, or maybe if it is ethics, then you go to ethics and make a good study, and then look at the secondary literature, and then, you think, how to do that. But basically today in the world, unless you know what others have done, you can't really do a good research. Because it's no point you are doing something and to see that somebody has done it already. Okay? Now this is why in the academic research, we always talk about a literature survey. Now when you write a proposal, you are writing about, first literature survey. I mean, there you have to show that who are the people who have done research before. What have they done, at least in brief. And then you say, why are you doing it? Right? Suppose you have 7, 8 people who have done it before you, and then you review what they have done. If everybody has done it perfectly, then there is no reason for you to do it. But if you can find something they have not done perfectly, then you can say that although these people have done it, they have not done this part or something like that. And I am going to do that. So there is a reason for you to do that. That's why literature survey matters. So I gave you some names in Buddhist ethics. So there are, in the same manner, there are so many people written on other ideas. Now if you look at the modern Buddhist literature, so many people have written on the Buddhist concept of truth, Four Noble Truths. There are so many people. So we need to get some idea about what people have written. Okay? So then only we know, at the very beginning of these discussions, I said to you, we are generating a new knowledge. So how are we generating a new knowledge? We have to do something beyond what already people have done. Now, if we don't know what people have done, we don't know whether what we are saying is a new knowledge or not. Okay, that's why. So, Reverend, answering your question, there is no such thing as what is the good area or bad area. But for a researcher, what is more important is to find the reason for doing a research. If 10 people have written on ethics, you can be the 11th person, but what are you going to say? Do you have anything new to say? Then by all means go ahead and write. Do the research. Okay, that's what it is. Any other questions? Comments? Yes, sir. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
There's a phone number 2. How should we study phone number 2 from the perspective of the logic?
Well, actually, when you say perspective of logic, now perspective of logic is basically consistency, coherence, and logicality. Now, from those perspectives, I mean, you can raise some of the questions like how Four Noble Truths are connected to the other doctrines. Okay. Now then we are talking about the coherence of it, right? Whether Four Noble Truths tally with what the Buddha said, other things. For example, Buddha talk, say for example, I mean Four Noble Truths talk about dukkha. But then on the other hand, Buddha talks about sukha. So how the sukha and dukkha go together? What is the real picture? If everything is dukkha or sukha. So, asking that type of questions, it doesn't mean that ultimately we are saying something against the Buddha of Four Noble Truths. But you are asking a question in the critical manner so that you can make it very clear. For example, some people say Buddhism is a pessimism. Pessimism means everything is ending in suffering, so sorrowful. Now, that's a question, you can ask a philosophical question. Is it true? Whether ultimately Buddha is pessimist. Buddha is saying that everything is sorrowful or suffering. That's a question about consistency and coherence. So you can see different places what the Buddha has said. So you can see whether these things tally with each other. Because some people would say that according to Buddhism, everything is suffering. But you don't want to say that. If you don't want to say that, how are you going to prove it? Okay. So you can do logical study means logicality, rationality. Okay. Not really we are talking about logical principles. That's a different thing. Okay. I mean, we can do that type of study also. What are the logical reasoning of the Buddha? How the Buddha has done logical, that's a different part, of course, We have to study logic and then also you have to get, of course there is so much use, when we study Kathavatta, you can see that there are many logical principles, implicitly. It doesn't say clearly, but of course accepted and followed. So, you can do that type of thing also. But basically what I mean by logical study is from the logical perspective, covering number one. Okay. Asking questions and that sort of. Any other questions? I know that sometimes you may have your questions, but please don't hesitate to ask. The other thing is you can write down your questions if you don't want to ask, do that. Because sometimes, you may be hesitating of but you can write. You can write down in a note and then I can answer that. Okay, I don't want to force you to ask questions, but I expect all of you to ask questions and not having a nap in the class, but okay. So we will wind up our discussion for today, and then tomorrow we will be discussing Kathavatta. Thank you very much.